Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk about the aftermath of the First World War and its impact on the United States. Specifically, we'll look at President Woodrow Wilson's plan for a post-war peace, including his idea to establish what was called the League of Nations. We'll also talk about the Versailles Peace Conference and the provisions of that treaty. We will examine the opposition facing Wilson in securing ratification of the treaty in the Senate. And then finally, we'll discuss the major challenges facing the post-war United States. The horrific fighting and destruction may have ended, but Europe's post-war future was still in considerable upheaval. Woodrow Wilson had promised, quote, a great crusade that would make the world safe for democracy. But with the enormous devastation produced by the war, it created popular pressure for an outcome that was just and lasting. People wanted the Great War to be the war to end all wars. Woodrow Wilson had led the nation into a war promising a more just and stable peace at its conclusion. Well before the armistice, he was already preparing to lead the fight for what he considered a democratic post-war settlement. On January 8, 1918, Wilson appeared before Congress to present the principles for which he claimed the nation was fighting. In what's known as the 14 points, Wilson declared his highest principles. He included recommendations for adjusting post-war boundaries and establishing new nations to replace the multinational Austria-Hungary and Ottoman empires. Those recommendations reflected his belief in the right of self-determination, that is, peoples of the same ethnicity should be able to form their own country. He also set forth principles to govern future international conduct. This included ideas such as freedom of the seas, open covenants instead of secret treaties, free trade, arms reduction, and a mediation of colonial claims. But the centerpiece for Wilson's 14 points was his plan for peace in the creation of a League of Nations, and this would help implement these new principles and resolve future controversies. The 14 points reflected Wilson's belief that with modern institutions and an international community to enforce basic principles of conduct, then the human race could live in peace. So let's take a closer look at the Versailles Peace Conference and the terms of the peace treaty itself. As the war neared its end, Germany requested an end to fighting on the basis of the 14 points. The Allies, however, were willing to accept the plan only as a basis of negotiation. Wilson, though, was confident that popular support would enable him to win over the Allied approval for his peace plan. Yet he made some pretty bad decisions at the war's end that would come back to haunt him when he's trying to get the peace treaty ratified. Wilson decided that he would personally lead the American delegation to the peace conference in Paris, and the negotiations would take place just outside of Paris at Versailles. Now, never before had a sitting American president left the nation for such a long period of time. Wilson was gone for about 6 months, leading many Americans to believe that the president was totally out of touch with them. Additionally, Wilson did not invite any Republican senators to attend the conference. Now, this would later become problematic for Wilson in that he would need the Senate's approval for any treaty that was made. Also in 1918, the midterm elections were held, and Wilson and the Democrats had lost control of Congress. Former Republican President William Taft grumbled that Wilson had intended to, quote, hog the whole show in Paris. So Wilson is facing lots of animosity. But when he arrived in Europe, he arrived to a welcome that very few men in history have ever experienced. The people turned out in millions to celebrate Wilson's arrival. To the war-weary people of Europe, Wilson was nothing less than a savior, the man who would change the world for the better. Nevertheless, the Allied leaders' objectives bore very little relationship to Wilson's vision of a liberal peace. The so-called Big Four at the conference represented very bitter, vindictive nations that had suffered horrendously in the war, and they were in no mood for a generous peace. Moreover, they really resented what they considered Wilson's tone of moral superiority. For instance, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, said of Wilson, quote, he's as slippery as an eel, and I never know when to count on him. Likewise, George Clemenceau of France said, quote, God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them. Mr. Wilson has given us the 14 points. We shall see. The peace conference itself lasted from January to June 1919, and the negotiations were less satisfying from Wilson's point of view, as he was forced time and time again to back down on most of his 14 points. The treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors in the palace at Versailles on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Its terms were extremely harsh to Germany. In terms of territorial changes, Germany was forced to give up all of her colonies and vast amounts of territory all over the world to the Allies. In other territorial matters, Wilson had to abandon the commitment to self-determination, whereby every ethnic group would be allowed to form its own nation. As a result of the war, 4 long-standing multinational empires had disintegrated: the Russian, Austria-Hungary, German, and Ottoman empires. So hundreds of millions of people had to be reorganized into new nations. So there was really no way to make Europe's boundaries correspond to the complicated ethnic groupings. Also, in order to keep Germany weak militarily, there was a disarmament clause that limited the German army to just 100,000 volunteers, and it forbade any type of conscription. The region known as the Rhineland, a 30-mile zone between Germany and France, was also demilitarized for 15 years. So if Germany began rearming, then France could quickly send its military through the Rhineland and meet the threat. The German Navy was also reduced to a few small ships. Submarines, military aircraft, and war industries were also prohibited. But probably the most egregious part of the peace terms for Germany was the war guilt and the reparations stipulations. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, despite the fact that the war actually started with Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Also, the Germans were made to pay reparations for war damages. The amount was initially set at $56 billion, but essentially the Allies told the Germans to start paying for the war damages, and they would let them know when it was enough. By 1931, Germany had paid $9 billion, and then under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, repudiated the rest of the debt. The treaty also made a provision to create a League of Nations, and this was the main part of Wilson's 14 points. The League would provide a world organization to effectively eliminate international anarchy. It would be a peaceful community of nations that would solve problems by international cooperation and disarmament. Article 10 of the Charter, which Wilson called the Heart of the League, the pledged member nations would impose military and economic sanctions against any kind of aggression. And it made it very clear that the use of an armed force would be the last resort under the League of Nations, under this Article 10. So on the whole, the Versailles Treaty proved to be a total disaster. Its provisions only succeeded in arousing resentment in Germany, and then later by attacking the treaty, particularly the war guilt and the reparations clauses, the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler gained the support of the German people. Hitler, who had been a young corporal during the war, rejected the provisions of the Versailles Treaty, saying, quote, "It cannot be that 2 million Germans have fallen in vain. We demand vengeance." The treaty itself made little effort to come to terms with revolutionary Russia as well. In 1918-1919, the Allies gave a half-hearted effort to try to overthrow Vladimir Lenin, but it failed. In 1933, the United States officially recognized the Soviet Union. Now let's examine the challenges facing Wilson as he battled for ratification of the Versailles Treaty in the United States. During the summer of 1919, Wilson returned home and focused all of his attention on the passage of the Versailles Treaty. Massachusetts Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, who was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, led Republicans in the Senate. He was very powerful, and Lodge and the Senate Republicans were very bitterly hostile to Wilson. Lodge argued that the League of Nations could possibly involve the United States in a war, which violated the Constitution, because under the Constitution, only Congress has the exclusive power to declare war. Lodge also denounced what he called the Versailles Treaty's foolish scheme of making mankind suddenly virtuous by a statute or a written constitution. Additionally, Lodge believed that Wilson had promised more than he could deliver, and that his great and lofty principles always entailed great sacrifices. It wasn't just the Congress who disagreed with the Treaty of Versailles. There was resentment felt by many of the different ethnic groups in America as well. German, Italian, and Irish Americans strongly disliked the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Additionally, liberal Americans were disappointed that Wilson had compromised on reparations and territories. Some Republicans went so far as to claim that Wilson's preoccupation with the League of Nations indicated that he wanted to be president of the world. And Wilson, he pretty much dismissed all of his critics as, quote, blind and little provincial people. He refused to consider any sort of compromise. Instead, Wilson undertook an extensive speaking tour all across the country in order to enlist the support of the American people. But the Republicans in the Senate reminded Wilson that it wasn't the American people who would ratify this, it would be the Senate itself. But nevertheless, Wilson went on this grand speaking tour to try to sell this plan to the American people. The whole world, Wilson claimed, was relying on the United States to sign the Versailles Treaty. And he asked all the crowds of the people that he encountered, quote, dare we reject it and break the heart of the world? On his speaking tour, Wilson traveled an estimated incredible 10,000 miles and made 32 speeches in just 22 days. So it was a grueling schedule for Wilson. And as it turned out, the strain was too much for the 63-year-old president. He began suffering from blinding headaches and numbness that prompted his doctor to insist that he return to Washington, D.C. So the president was taken back to Washington, and then on October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, causing a severe stroke that left him paralyzed on one side of his body, and he remained an invalid pretty much the rest of his life. Wilson's wife, Edith, along with his aides and trusted cabinet members, kept him isolated from all but the most essential business. The effects of the stroke only seemed to intensify Wilson's stubbornness as he adamantly refused to compromise with Lodge and the Republicans, and he was extremely confrontational with the opposition. The Senate, in the meantime, overwhelmingly defeated the Treaty of Versailles. Later, the United States would negotiate a peace treaty that ended the war with Germany, but it was one that did not provide for a League of Nations. The League of Nations went forward without the participation of the United States, and that led to some of its weakness. The League did not include all major nations. Russia, Germany, Japan, and Italy will all join the League, but they all also began withdrawing by the 1930s. League decisions also required a unanimous vote to take any action. It also lacked the power to tax or to draft an army. Essentially, it was just an association of independent nations and not a world government. Finally, in 1946, the League disbanded altogether, and it transferred its properties to the United Nations, something that we'll talk more about later on. So now let's turn our attention to the post-war challenges facing American society. During all the confusion of post-war life, many Americans confronted a threat that produced more casualties than the war itself. It became known as the Spanish flu, and it spread all around the globe. The pandemic erupted in the spring of 1918, and it lasted a year, killing as many as 100 million people worldwide, twice as many that had died as had died in the First World War. In the United States alone, it claimed the lives of 675,000 people, nearly 7 times the number of American combat deaths in France. No disease in human history had killed so many people so quickly, and it was so bad that mortuaries ran out of coffins and morgues essentially ran out of space. By the spring of 1919, the pandemic finally had seemingly run its course, and it ended just about as suddenly as it had begun. But no plague, war, famine, or natural catastrophe in world history killed so many people in such a short amount of time. Disease was only one of the many challenges facing Americans in the post-war era. At first, the wartime boom continued, but it rested largely on the lingering effect of the war and some sudden temporary demands. But by late 1920, the economic bubble had burst and inflation was on the rise. Labor leaders set out to try to consolidate the advances that they had made in the war. But rising inflation wiped out the modest wage gains that workers had achieved. Laborers also worried about job security as veterans returned to the workforce. Difficult working conditions continued to also be a source of discontent among workers. So the year 1919 saw an unprecedented wave of strikes. More than 3,600 strikes erupted, involving over 4 million workers in the United States. Most workers sought higher wages and shorter work weeks, but their critics linked them with a worldwide communist revolution. For instance, most of the Boston police force in September 1919 went out on strike. then Governor Calvin Coolidge and future President of the United States, called out the National Guard, saying, quote, "There's no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." And this strong action brought Coolidge national attention and probably launched his presidential career. After 4 days, the police strikers offered to come back, but the commissioner at this time refused to take them back, and he hired replacements instead. Steelworkers also went out on strike in September 1919. 350,000 workers walked off the job, but eventually this strike failed too. So the summer of 1919 sparked lots of unrest, and there was a period of deadly race riots that also erupted during this summer across the country. Nearly 400,000 African American men had served in the armed forces during the war. And as they came home in 1919, the veterans moved to different parts of the country. The soldiers themselves were an inspiration to thousands of urban African Americans, and when the veterans returned, there were many parades held. Many of the veterans walked down the main streets of black neighborhoods led by jazz bands. By 1919, the racial climate, however, was not any better. In fact, it seemed like it had grown more violent, if anything. In the South, there was a sudden increase in lynching. Black veterans didn't really find any significant new opportunities for them when they returned. Rural black migrants to northern cities also encountered white communities who were very hostile towards them. So it wasn't just racism in the South. Wartime riots in East St. Louis, for instance, and elsewhere, were a prelude to a summer of racial violence. In Chicago, a terrible race war broke out when a black teenager was drowned by some white swimmers. Fighting broke out between whites and blacks, and chaos ensued for more than a week. In the end, nearly 40 people were killed, over 500 injured, and more than 1,000 were left homeless. Now, these race riots were different in the fact that it was not merely whites fighting blacks, but blacks were now fighting back. And at the same time, Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey began to attract a wide group of African Americans, mostly among poor urban blacks. In a society where white represented the ideal, Marcus Garvey inverted the formula and glorified all things that were black. Garvey also organized one of the first mass movements in the black community. It was called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. Garvey called on the world's blacks to end imperialism in Africa and create modern societies. He rejected assimilation into white society, and he called on blacks to develop a pride in themselves and in their own achievements, something known as black nationalism. Through the UNIA, Garvey launched a chain of black-owned grocery stores and pressed for other black businesses. It was very popular. More than 80,000 blacks joined the UNIA and participated in many of their mass rallies and parades. However, the movement declined after Garvey was indicted in 1923 on charges of business fraud, and he was deported back to Jamaica. Nevertheless, the allure of black nationalism remained, and it would set a precedent for future civil rights actions. To many white middle-class Americans at the time, the racial violence and the waves of labor strikes all appeared to be very frightening. This was in part because other evidence emerging at the same time seemed to suggest that there was a radical menace at work. The Russian Revolution of 1917 made it clear that communism was no longer simply just a theory, but it was now an important regime. And there were concerns about the communist threat, and that grew in 1919 when the Soviet government announced plans for a worldwide revolution. So this sets into motion the so-called Red Scare in the United States. Ironically, only 70,000 Americans actually belonged or were actually card-carrying members of the U.S. Communist Party. But the public and the press in the United States continued to blame almost any disturbance on radicals. In the early spring of 1919, there were a series of bombings that really shocked the nation. Many people were, immediately were blaming communists for the bombings. In April 1919, the post office intercepted several dozen parcels addressed to leading businessmen and politicians that were triggered to explode when opened. In June 1919, another bomb destroyed the front of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's house in Washington, D.C. The explosion killed the terrorist and almost killed the Attorney General. So as the hysteria mounted, the federal government became more involved. President Wilson's stroke prevented him from providing any real decisive leadership in this matter, so Attorney General Palmer assumed control in dealing with the perceived radicalism. Palmer set up what he called an anti-radical division within the Justice Department, and he appointed a young government attorney, J. Edgar Hoover, to lead it. Soon it became known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover would wield some pretty great power from the FBI in later years. In November 1919, the Attorney General staged the first of what became known as the Palmer Raids. His dragnet caught thousands of aliens who had committed no crimes but were suspect for their anarchist beliefs. These people faced deportation without any kind of formal trial. For instance, in December 1919, a ship embarked for Finland and the Soviet Union with almost 300 deported radicals from the United States. The peak of Palmer's power came with his New Year's raids in 1920. In one night, he rounded up 6,000 suspected radicals. Agents had invaded private homes, union headquarters, and meeting halls. The government held both citizens and aliens without specific charges and denied them legal counsel. Palmer, who was now riding high on public approval, overstepped himself when he predicted a massive attack on the U.S. government May 1st, 1920. May 1st was May Day, which was a traditional holiday associated with socialism, and Palmer predicted there would be widespread attacks on the U.S. government. So as a result, buildings were put under protection, state militia was called up, and police units were put on 24-hour alerts. The day passed, however, without a single incident occurring. So by this time, the hysteria of the Red Scare began to wane during the summer of 1920. The bombings had more or less tapered off, and the waves of strikes and race riots had somewhat receded by this time. There was a bombing that took place in September of 1920 on the corner of Broad and Wall Streets in New York City. 38 people were killed in this attack. But by this time, and this is evidence as far as the Red Scare beginning to wane a bit, Americans tended to believe that this bombing of Wall Street by September of 1920 was the work of crazed-minded people and not the beginnings of some grand, widespread communist revolution. Nevertheless, the Red Scare left a very ugly legacy. Constitutional rights were violated as American citizens were held without formally being charged with a crime, and then they were denied proper legal counsel. The deportation of hundreds of innocent people also took place during this so-called Red Scare. And the Red Scare encouraged nativism and intolerance throughout the country. Fear of radicalism fueled all these nativist sentiments throughout the 1920s. The most notorious outburst of hysteria occurred in 1921. It involved Nicola Sacco, who was a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who was a fish peddler. And these two men were Italian immigrants who were living in Massachusetts. A court convicted them of murdering a guard and a paymaster during a Massachusetts robbery. And during the trial, evidence failed to prove their involvement in the robbery. In fact, Sacco testified that he was at the Italian consulate obtaining a passport the day of the murder. And his alibi was actually upheld. It seemed, though, that Sacco and Vanzetti were being tried not so much for the crime, but they're being tried based on their political beliefs. They were anarchists, and they were being tried for the fact that they were Italian immigrants. A jury in 1921 found them guilty. After repeated appeals, they died in the electric chair on August 23, 1927. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial received international attention as the case exposed the deep resentments in American society during the 1920s. Now, in the election of 1920, Woodrow Wilson had hopes of making a run for re-election. Remember, at this time, there was no limit on how many times a person could serve as president. So he had entertained the idea of running for re-election, but it's really largely unrealistic because his health continued to decline and he will die in 1924. Instead, the Democrats ran James Cox of Ohio. Cox chose as his running mate a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an individual that we'll talk much more about later on. The Republicans chose Warren G. Harding, also of Ohio, who promised a return to normalcy. And by the election of 1920, the American people had grown tired of war and tired of any kind of progressive reform. Harding promised a return to the party of William McKinley, and this included things like less government, a reduction of federal spending, lower taxes, and less overall regulation. He also promised a government that would be based on laissez-faire, pledging that government would keep their hands off of businesses. Harding won the election, and while he was basically an honest man, he was also a very pliable man, leading his administration to be filled with corruption. So in the decade that followed the Great War, Americans having experienced the constraints and horrors of war, Americans during the 1920s will enthusiastically pursue mass pleasure and entertainment. Yet even in this, as we'll see, modernists and traditionalists will wage a cultural warfare on one another.